Welcome to Season 2 of The Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Matthews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from the complexity of development to the art of resistance, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining our futures. We have an exciting theme planned for the remainder of the season, and that will be unveiled in our second episode. In this first episode, we were very fortunate to be able to speak with Kumi Naidoo, a charismatic South African human and environmental rights activist. From being a young activist fighting apartheid, Kumi has led various global campaigns to end poverty and fight for climate justice, including being at the helm of various international NGOs such as Civicus, Greenpeace, and Amnesty International. He has been Global Ambassador for Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity since June 2020 and is currently a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. We speak about art and activism in this conversation, how art can help inform new vision and recharge imagination in the fight for climate justice, and his own efforts in this area. One of his key collaborators is Olafur Eliasson, an Icelandic-Danish artist known for sculptured and large-scale installation art, employing elemental materials such as light, water, and air temperature to enhance the viewer's experience. In this conversation, he talks about how we need to engage with the climate crisis ahead, celebrating youth movements that are taking the reign, but also playing our part through a more complex look at how entangled activism has become and how unreflective. After we recorded the interview, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has just published its 6th assessment report by its Working Group 2, which assesses the impacts of climate change on nature and humanity and their capacities and limits for adaptation. It is a very sobering read, and the final line of the report resonates with what Kumi highlights in the interview. Any further delay in concerned anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. We are releasing this first episode of our new season at a time of severe anxiety, war, and heightened global tensions. This war also highlights the pitfalls of relying on a fossil fuel-driven economy and the price we pay for severe global inequalities. From listening to Kumi, I am inspired to think and act, as I'm sure you will be too. Kumi, thank you so much for joining us at The Subverse. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you with us. You have been on the front lines of environmental and social justice for decades. I wanted to ask you about the last meeting that you attended in Glasgow, which was COP26. You were obviously there with a range of governments, policymakers, and activists, and especially youth activists. I wanted your assessment of the conference itself and some of the takeaways and what you consider to be the big opportunities and the big obstacles that we face.
Thank you, Susan. If there wasn't such a thing known as the COPs or Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, because, this using the term COP doesn't make it more accessible to people. So basically, if it didn't exist, we would have to create it. But let's be honest, that the current negotiating environment and so on is not just, it's not equitable. Just to give you one example, the largest delegation to the COP was actually the fossil fuel industry. They had 503 delegates, more than even the UK government as a host government had fewer delegates. Just to put that in perspective, that's like Alcoholics Anonymous having a big global conference and the biggest sponsor to the conference is the alcoholic industry, So what I think we got out of this COP was simply a chance to live to fight another day. We did not get a solution because what's on the table after Glasgow, assuming every country implements everything that they committed to, we still guaranteed a 2.7 degree world as things stand, right? And where the science is saying it needs to be below 1.5. And I don't know whether most of your listeners know, but, most people forget that we are at 1.1 degree already. And at 1.1 degree, we're seeing such extreme weather events and so on. So therefore, we are fast running out of time. And people in the Pacific, for example, have been chanting a slogan since 2015 that went 1.5 to stay alive. 1.5 to stay alive. And then 6 months later, by the time we were in Paris, the slogan had changed to 1.5, we might survive. That was in 2015. So that's on the sort of realistic side. But we need the COP to deliver the solutions. We can't, give up on it. But let's be very clear, we can't put all our eggs in the COP basket. That's the main message. We cannot put all our eggs in the COP basket. That's one side of struggle, and that needs to continue. I would just conclude on the positive side. What the COP showed me was new energies of activism, new alliances, new coalitions, people willing to dream and boldly about other things to do, ways of doing things that we didn't do before and so on. And in that sense, what was more inspiring was not what was happening inside the negotiations, but what was happening with those that were not allowed to be inside the negotiations.
One thing that I have found in some of the episodes that we've done on the Subverse is that at least in the global south, there's also been this question raised by some scholars and activists about kind of the rise of kind of climate colonialism. It's a term I've heard used a few times. But of course, people say different things under that particular rubric. One issue which has come up, which is that in the sort of the search for the right degrees, people have, let's say, bought land and used them as carbon offsets. And that has then led to forced evictions and food scarcity. And this has happened in Africa and in other parts of the world. You also have efforts to boost energy security. And that has also driven a kind of climate colonialism. So again, looking at the African continent, it paradoxically is home to the largest solar power plant. And yet you have the least number of people connected to the grid in the continent itself. And I wondered about some of these critiques that have come up and your views on that.
Firstly, it's important to note that even in the climate movement, which has been dominated by people from the global north, there was very, very high levels of resistance as late as 2009, even for us to use the term climate justice. Because people said, you start talking about justice, people in the US and Europe and so on start getting worried about reparations their government has to pay for historical, choices that they made on energy systems and so on. And so climate justice as a frame, it's worth us just reminding, that is saying that those that are paying now the most brutal and biggest impacts from climate change are those that are contributed less. So when in the climate negotiations framework, they talk about every country having common but differentiated responsibilities. And the differentiated responsibilities was to put greater responsibilities in those countries whose economies benefited from decimating the forests and nature and so on in the name of so-called civilization and development, right? And but already by 2009, people like myself started saying, actually, we need to introduce a new term to this conversation beyond climate justice, and that's the term climate apartheid, right? Because if you look at which parts of the world historically have contributed to this problem and which parts are paying the first and most brutal price, which parts of the world are more vulnerable, and so on, it's a very uncomfortable demographic picture, right? That it is people of color that are paying the biggest and most brutal prices. It's not to say that people in the North who have been largely immune from climate impacts, but who are now not escaping it either, but not on a scale that we see in the global South. So I think that climate colonialism, let's be very clear, we're still living in an age of neocolonialism. The economic systems, the way we produce things and all, it's still sort of in a post-neocolonial kind of framework. So the fact that the way the rich dominant nations in the North would seek to relate with funding and with solutions and so on, I don't think anybody is surprised. that it is done in a colonial mindset and in a colonial framework.
While you were in Glasgow, you taped a conversation with the Icelandic-Danish artist Olafur Eliasson. In the conversation, you spoke about art and activism. And I'm really curious to hear more about what started off this conversation with him and also connected to the work that you're now doing in Berlin.
Thanks, Susan. Firstly, it's clear that the biggest challenge that activism faces right now is probably not the repressive state apparatus, which is the army, police, formal use of laws, all of which are being deployed aggressively against activism and people who are working for change. But I would still say that's not the biggest challenge we face. The biggest challenge we face is the ideological state apparatus, by which I mean the framework for education, the framework for religion, social norms and customs, the funding of arts and culture, and critically the framework for communications and media. And if we look at why activism is failing, then we need to, or why the climate fight is not winning as fast and as big as we need to, I would say the biggest challenge is that we are not able to break through the communications deficits that we find. I mean, when I was the head of Greenpeace, say, right, if I took all of Greenpeace's global budget, right, it was not equal to even 10% of Shell or BP's marketing budget alone, you know? So, you know, if you look at the information war and the disinformation war, the fossil fuel industry and its allies in government are able to confuse the global public and delay action. So I have been speaking to this issue for a long time. And, you know, and I've come to the view that culture drives politics, politics does not drive culture. And by the way, something that Steve Bannon and right-wingers seem to understand much better these days than so-called progressives, right? In the sense that, you know, we have to respect the cultural rhythms of people, right? And humble ourselves, take us to where people are and build from, you know, what people understand. So one of the ways we can turn things around is definitely by looking at how, and you know, you coming from the UN, you'll understand this, right? I'm coming from an international NGO background for part of my life, and I know this. Let's be blunt about it, right? Most of the documents you came across when you're at the UN, and most of the documents that I came across when I was at INGOs, 90% of our friends, family, and people we care about, even those that are educated, won't know what the hell was in those documents because they're written in a policy wonkish way and so on. So it's not to say that the problem of communications is only about the structural challenges of how do we look at a media that's corporate control, government control, and so on. But I'm also saying there is space for creativity even within the current constraints of media by progressive activists trying to communicate better. And so Olafur Eliasson is a very inspirational friend of mine. He's been doing really amazing climate communications over time that speaks to the heart and so on. So he and I are trying to pull our energies together while we are here to encourage people in the arts and culture world and people in the activist world to come together, find common ground, look at how they enter into a relationship that's mutually beneficial and respectful, and in a hope that that could add to addressing the communicating. I understand it's not the single solution, but it could, I hope, and all of our hopes, could contribute to us being able to reach larger numbers of people more quickly through communication mediums that does not just speak to people's minds, but speak to their hearts and their souls, because that's what it's going to take for us to win.
We'll be back after a break. What I find very exciting about working within the field or the realm of art, which is that it is disobedient and it is transgressive and it is critical in ways in which sometimes policy is not.
Absolutely. And, you know, there's that great James Baldwin quote, you know, where, and if I might quote it, which says, "The artist must always know that the visible reality hides a deeper one, and that all our action and our achievement rests on things unseen. A society must assume that it is stable, but the artist must know, and he must let us know, that there is nothing stable under heaven. And let's be very clear. Humanity is sleepwalking into a crisis of epic proportions given how close to the climate cliff we are and how drastically inequality has, grown. But I think that both communities need each other. But if you ask me, activism needs arts and culture much more than arts and culture needs activism.
Would you be able to tell us, Kumi, what are the kinds of projects that you're involved in right now? Anything that you can sort of share with us and our listeners?
So, Olafur is running a very active studio and has overloaded. I'm doing a piece of work on rethinking activism and launching a series of podcasts and so on, right? And quite challenging in itself. Essentially, what Olafur and I are wanting to do is to catalyze conversation and action. And that video at COP and the interviews we did around COP was to stimulate the conversation. So right now I'm in conversation with a range of cultural activists as a result of that. And one of the things that we're exploring is whether we can bring together an online global artivism conference, right? Where we explore how we can work better together, how we can highlight some examples of excellence and so on.
Wonderful. I like that term, artivism. It's an interesting term. Yes. I think that we have lots to learn from how people work in arts and culture. There's something far more organic about it and some of the policy discussions and policy work that we do. I had a question here talking about the arts. A lot of literature and fiction, especially in the last couple of years, which have explored, let's say, different kinds of futures, within science fiction, within climate fiction. Amitav Ghosh in his Great Derangement talks a lot about this. And I wonder whether that has also inspired the kind of work that you're doing, and what is the role that fiction can play in helping us imagine new futures?
I think this is the biggest challenge we have right now, I would argue, is a challenge of imagination, right? That there is such a high level of cognitive dissonance by those in power, both corporate power as well as governmental power, that they are denying what the facts on the ground is. That they can see sort of a train coming in their direction and somehow hope that at the last minute somebody's going to just switch the train off, and nothing bad would happen. And so when you have this scale of lack of imagination, right, then we need arts and culture to use fiction as one of its really important vehicles to show different worlds that don't exist right now, which are more equal, more just, more sustainable, more creative, more loving, more compassionate. And I think the role of fiction in presenting these options of a different world is possible is something that I think can add value, and I encourage it very strongly.
I also wanted to know a little bit more about your own podcast, which you started a couple of months ago, and what you plan actually to do with that particular form of expression.
So the People Power and Planet podcast, the first series, was very much trying to dialogue with activists and other leaders around the world to raise the question of it's so desperate that we reconstruct the social contract between governments and people everywhere in the world. So that was very focused on the social contract question, and that's all available. And there's 12 episodes with amazing people from around the world sharing their perspectives of if they were to write a social contract, this is what it would look like. And it's good to see some of the ideas that came out of that. And then the second series, which I'm just starting to record now, is very much focused on the question of why is activism not winning on the scale and the pace that it needs to win, and what needs to change to allow us to do that. So firstly, we need to be saying to ourselves, in this moment of history, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And I would say to people to be inspired by the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu when he said, we should be comfortable to be prisoners of hope, right? And let's be honest here. We are facing a small window of opportunity to avert the worst of climate catastrophe and to reverse the suicidal trajectory that humanity has been on for some time. That window of opportunity is not massive. It's small and closing fast, but it's still there. It is still there, and we morally have an opportunity, have an obligation to push through that window and keep that window open and make it bigger and bigger until we can secure our children and their children's futures. The pessimism of the analysis, not only for young people, for everybody, I think can best be overcome by the optimism of our action. And I believe that right now, what we need to be doing is two sets of energies. One, we need to recognize that our governments and the big corporates will not allow us to build alternatives that work, because that will challenge those that benefit from the current system. So while we try to resist the expansion in fossil fuels and all the conventional sort of oppositional activities, I think we also need to start community by community figuring out ways to build models of alternatives, whether it's community-based recycling programs, renewable energy, decentralized small solar grids in communities, and so on. We need to figure out ways in which we can showcase how this is done from below up and embarrass our political leaders into action. So the last thing I would say is, some people genuinely say that it's too late. Certainly, it's too late for the people whose lives have been lost already from climate impacts. I know there are lots of privileged people in the global north who think we have a lot of time. But for people who are dying now, let's be just clear that these people have contributed least to the problem and are paying the first and most brutal price. So even if humanity is going down, then let's just make sure that those that brought us to this point of destruction are held accountable. That might not give us too much of comfort and optimism, but from a perspective of justice, that might give us a sense of resolve.
That's really well put. I think there are so many perspectives. So there are perspectives around survival, there's perspectives around equality. And as you mentioned, the whole issue of accountability and justice is equally important, not something that we can forget in these fights that we take on. When you talk about activism, I'm also reminded of a book by Anthea Lawson called The Entangled Activist. Very interestingly, she talks about how activism has also become entangled in the problems it seeks to solve. And she talks about how I think all us activists will also have to do a kind of soul searching in terms of our own hierarchies, our own hegemonies, in terms of how we also look at the system and how we've also become complicit.
I fully agree with this point. I mean, if we look at the international NGO environment, right, of which I've been part of for at least sort of 1/3 of my activist life, right? And the sad reality is, even though people like me were headhunted to head up certain NGOs and so on, because when they approached me, they said we needed to address the issue of inequality in power and that our organizations claim to be global but are very northern dominated and so on. And so the sad reality is today, as we sit and have this conversation, with very few exceptions, most of our international NGOs are blatantly structurally racist, right? In terms of how power is devolved, how decisions are made, who has the final say and so on. And so in that sense, all of us, including, I'm saying all of us have to be questioning our consumption level, our ethics and so on. And basically none of us have the luxury right now in this moment to think that we're not going to be called upon to consider our lifestyles and be willing to make changes in the interests of a bigger goal, which is protecting our children and their children. And let's be blunt about it, right? Right now, the biggest disease we're suffering from is not COVID, is affluenza. Affluenza is a pathological illness where people have been led to believe that a good, meaningful, decent life comes from more and more and more and more material acquisitions, right? And that inequality, right? And that to get those acquisitions, you have to tramp around 25,000 people in the process and all of that, right? If you see how the system operates. So let's just be clear. What we saw after the global financial crisis, where governments in power and corporations basically pushed a logic of system recovery system protection, system maintenance. What was needed then and what is even needed more urgently right now is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. We should dissuade ourselves, we should throw the idea away that we are going to get out of this deep structural and systemic crisis that climate and inequality has brought us to with, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic or, limited changes here, baby steps in the right way. The only way we secure this planet is by recognizing that we need a fundamentally different economic system, energy system, transport system, food system, and so on, which not only addresses the climate challenge, but also addresses the absolute injustice and unsafety by having such vast levels of inequality.
There is so much interesting literature and thought around degrowth. A lot of people don't like that term, but it's time that we start looking at the arguments people are making. They're very reasonable, they're very practical, but it does require kind of a big shift in terms of how we think.
I think that what should give us optimism when we look at these questions is that young people whose lenses to the world are less contaminated than those of us that have been around for decades fighting the good fight. And I think that what we're needing right now is to create as much space for younger people to take leadership, for them to look at old problems with fresh eyes, given the space to innovate. When I look at some of the most creative things I've seen in the climate space, they're coming from young people. They're not coming from people of my generation. And as my daughter said to me on one occasion, when I said, based on my experience, she should do something, she said, Dad, your generation are contaminated by bad experience, keep pushing your bad experience on us. So I say to young people, don't wait to take leadership. You got to step forward. Sometimes some people in leadership say, give us time. It takes a long time to change things. But why should we give people time when we're seeing they're going in the wrong direction? We should stop them and redirect them. So right now, let's be realistic. There are lots of people who benefit from the current system. And those companies and individuals who control many of our governments are not going to give up without a fight. And therefore, this is also a moment for massive moral courage from those that are organizing to, move from an economy driven by dirty fossil fuel-based energy to an economy that's driven by clean, green, renewable-based energy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kumi. I'm curious, in terms of your own work at the Robert Bosch Academy, how much longer will you stay there and what are your plans, for your own future? And also in terms of, our climate futures, if you have some words that you can sort of offer us at the end of this conversation that we can take away, love to hear from you. Thank you.
So I'm here till the end of May, and hopefully I will have finished the podcast series on rethinking activism as well as a short book. And I hope to have done some further activities with Olafoyle Eisen, which will encourage people both in the arts and culture world and the activist world to reach out, find each other, and make common ground. I am then not 100% sure where I will put my energies other than knowing that I'm going to be going home. But I do think that the big question that I am struggling with is, does one try to do what one has tried to do for a couple of decades now, which is try to get a system that is completely broken to deliver beyond the optimal level that that system was designed to deliver, or whether one actually says we have to position ourselves completely outside of that system to create the new. And I think it's very difficult to take an absolute position one or the other, but you can make a decision on proportionality, meaning you can say I'm primarily outside of the system, but obviously if you have a bank account or you have a job, you're in the system, right? But how much one, spends in meetings with people in government and business, trying to convince them of things that they know and we've told them 1,000 times, maybe that's not going to be the most useful use of our energy. Maybe it is to redirect our gaze to the people who are powerless rather than the people who are powerful, appealing to them, and support people who have limited, to aggregate the power and to be more powerful in the fights that lie ahead. So to end, The struggle for justice, economic justice, climate justice, social justice, gender justice, and so on, these struggles are marathons. They're not sprints. And the biggest contribution that any one of us can make is once we've come to understand the urgency of the question or the injustice that it represents, then I hope that people will buckle down, recognize that it's going to be a long fight, it's going to be a marathon, we're not going to win it in a day, that there will be many setbacks along the way, there will be tragedies and pain along the way, but just budget for that, keep a positive attitude, and don't let the Trumps and the Modis and the Bolsonaros of the world deprive you of your future and deprive you of your youth in the current moment. That's my message to young people, right? That you should intensify your resistance to injustice by all means. Intensify it. But please, in addition to intensifying it, have fun, enjoy each other, sing, dance, laugh, because even if you're going to go down as a species, let's go down fighting. And also, let's just be clear that people like myself probably have said far too often, save the planet, save the planet, save the planet. The planet does not need saving, right? We continue on the path that we are on. We will be gone. The planet will still be here. Truth be said, once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So people have to recognize there's a struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing less and nothing more than protecting our children and their children's future. This is the biggest struggle humanity has ever faced. So let's just get used to the idea that we've got a big fight, and let's try and have as much fun, joy, love each other, celebrate each other, and so on, while we try to bring sanity to a world where politics and economics has taken us to a point of absolute insanity, and hopefully there is still time to bring us back from it.
Wow, Kumi, thank you. So inspiring and so uplifting. Thank you for joining us in this episode. And if I could ever imagine a dream start for our second season, it's this one. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks to Kumi Naidu for sharing his thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures, with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.